in the frostbitten parking lot of Pine Ridge Community Center, where desperation wore the mask of charity and dignity crumbled beneath the auctioneer's gavel. Rebecca Hayes clutched her last $20 bill like a lifeline. The November wind cut through her thin jacket as she watched her former colleagues' belongings sold to the highest bidder, each lot a testament to dreams deferred and lives upended. The elementary school had closed 3 months ago, taking with it not just jobs, but the heart of this mountain community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Most items drew modest interest from locals looking for bargains, but when they wheeled out Lot 47, a collection of camping gear and survival equipment, the small crowd fell into an uncomfortable silence. The gear belonged to the mountain man, they whispered, the hermit who lived somewhere up in Glacier National Forest and came to town maybe twice a year for supplies. Nobody really knew his story, but everyone had theories about why a man would choose complete isolation over human company. Rebecca had heard the rumors too, stories about Daniel Walker that ranged from war veteran with PTSD to fugitive hiding from some unnamed crime. But as she studied the well-maintained equipment, the carefully organized camping supplies, she saw something different. These weren't the possessions of someone running from responsibility. They were the tools of someone who knew how to survive, how to be self-sufficient in a world that offered little mercy to those who fell through the cracks. When the auctioneer called for opening bids on the survival gear, Rebecca's hand rose before her rational mind could intervene. $20 for equipment worth easily 10 times that amount. But in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, nobody wanted to be associated with the mysterious mountain dweller. The gavel fell with the finality of a door closing, and Rebecca found herself the owner of gear she had no idea how to use, purchased with money she couldn't afford to spend. As she approached the collection table to claim her items, she noticed a man standing at the edge of the parking lot, his imposing frame silhouetted against the darkening Montana sky. Even at a distance, she could see the tension in his posture, the way he held himself like someone accustomed to being unwelcome. Daniel Walker stood 6 feet 4 inches in his worn leather boots, with shoulders broad enough to suggest years of physical labor and eyes the color of winter storms. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and a beard covered the lower half of a face that might have been handsome if it weren't set in such hard lines. He wore clothes that spoke of practicality over style, layers of flannel and denim, designed for function rather than appearance. When Rebecca approached with his gear loaded into the back of her aging Honda Civic, Daniel stepped forward with the careful movements of someone who understood that his size could be intimidating. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the rough edge of someone unaccustomed to regular conversation, "I believe you've purchased my belongings." "I did," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Though I'm not entirely sure." "Why?" It was an honest admission that seemed to catch him off guard. Most people in town either avoided him entirely or treated him with the kind of nervous politeness reserved for potentially dangerous animals. "Most folks around here wouldn't want anything to do with my gear," he observed, studying her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how she must look. Her teaching clothes were 3 days old, her hair needed washing, and she probably smelled like the community center's musty storage room where she'd been sleeping since losing her apartment. "Most folks around here haven't been living in their car for 2 weeks, she said with a bitter laugh. "I figured survival gear might come in handy, even if I don't know how to use it." The admission hung between them like a challenge, and Rebecca watched as something shifted in Daniel's expression. The wariness remained, but it was joined by something that might have been recognition, one outsider acknowledging another. "You're the teacher," he said after a moment. "From the elementary school." "Former teacher," she corrected. "Rebecca Hayes. And you're the mysterious mountain man everyone's afraid to talk to directly." "Daniel Walker," he replied. "And I prefer hermit. Has a better ring to it." Despite everything, Rebecca found herself smiling at his dry humor. "Well, Daniel Walker, I bought your gear fair and square, but I'm willing to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" She gestured toward the Honda, which was packed with everything she owned and looked about as roadworthy as a shopping cart. "Winter's coming, and I'm about one cold snap away from freezing to death in that car. You probably know these mountains better than anyone. I need protection from the elements, and maybe She paused, the words catching in her throat as desperation overrode pride. Maybe you need something too. Daniel was quiet for so long that Rebecca began to think she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested they were as much of a surprise to him as they were to her. You need protection, he said slowly, as if testing each word. I need a wife. The declaration struck her like a physical blow, not because it was threatening, but because it was so utterly unexpected. I'm sorry, what? Winter survival isn't a game up here, he continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining. A practical necessity rather than making a romantic proposition. Temperatures can drop to 40 below, and that's before you factor in wind chill. Your car won't keep you alive through a Montana winter, and the community center closes at night. I understand the weather situation, she said carefully, but I'm not sure how marriage factors into survival. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that suggested this conversation was as uncomfortable for him as it was surreal for her. I've got a cabin, well-built, well-stocked, warm. But I also have a situation that requires, he paused, searching for the right words, a certain kind of legitimacy. Legal legitimacy. What kind of situation? The kind that requires a man to have ties to the community, to appear settled and stable rather than. He gestured toward the mountains. Whatever it is people think I am. Rebecca studied his face, trying to read the truth behind words that sounded like they were covering something much more complex. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And you think marriage would provide that legitimacy? I think, he said carefully, that we both have problems that might solve each other. You need shelter and protection. I need someone who can help me blend in, be a bridge to normal society when necessary. The proposal was so clinical, so devoid of romance or emotion, that it almost made sense in a purely practical way. Almost. You're suggesting a marriage of convenience. I'm suggesting a partnership for mutual survival. Rebecca looked around. The nearly empty parking lot, at her car packed with her entire life, at the community center where she'd been sneaking in to sleep and shower when the cleaning crew wasn't around. The alternative to whatever Daniel Walker was offering wasn't just uncomfortable, it was potentially lethal. What exactly would this partnership involve, she asked. You'd have a warm place to stay, food, protection from the elements. In exchange, you'd help me when I need to interact with town officials, be a character witness if necessary, make me appear more, he struggled with the word, domesticated. And the marriage part. Legal protection for both of us. You'd have a legitimate address, access to my resources. I'd have someone who could vouch for my character and stability. It was insane. She was contemplating entering into a legal partnership with a man she'd met 15 minutes ago, a man whose reputation in town ranged from eccentric to dangerous. But as the wind picked up and she felt the first sting of snow in the air, insanity began to look remarkably like practicality. I don't know anything about you, she said finally. And I don't know anything about you, he replied. But I know. You were a teacher, which means you care about helping people. I know you bought my gear even though you couldn't afford it, which means you're either very kind or very desperate. And I know you're considering this proposal, which means you're brave enough to take calculated risks. What makes you think I can trust you? Daniel was quiet for a moment, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, well-worn book. When he handed it to her, she saw it was a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, the pages soft with handling and margins filled with careful notes. Anyone who makes notes in the margins of Harper Lee isn't planning to hurt a school teacher, he said simply. Rebecca flipped through the book, reading fragments of his handwritten observations, and found herself surprised by the thoughtfulness of his commentary, the insight into character and moral complexity that his notes revealed. This wasn't the marginalia of someone unstable or dangerous, but of someone who thought deeply about justice, morality, and human nature. You could have borrowed this from someone, she pointed out, though she was already beginning to believe. Otherwise, I could have, he agreed. Just like you could be a con artist posing as a teacher to take advantage of lonely mountain men. But we both have to trust something, and right now, trust is the only currency either of us has. The snow was falling harder now, and Rebecca could feel the temperature dropping as the sun disappeared behind the peaks. Her car would be cold tonight, and tomorrow night, and every night until spring if she was lucky enough to survive that. Long. If I agreed to this, she said slowly, what would the actual arrangement look like? My cabin is about an hour from here, up a private road that requires four-wheel drive. It's off-grid but comfortable, solar power, would heat, well water. There's a generator for backup and enough supplies to last through spring. You'd have your own space, your own privacy. And in return, sometimes I need to come to town for supplies or to deal with county officials. Having a wife makes those interactions easier, makes me seem less threatening to people who are naturally suspicious of men who live alone in the mountains. Why do you live alone in the mountains? Daniel's expression shuddered slightly, and Rebecca recognized the look of someone with secrets they weren't ready to share. Same reason you're sleeping in your car, I suspect. Sometimes life doesn't give you the choices you thought you'd have. It wasn't really an answer, but it was honest in its evasion. She appreciated that he didn't try to deflect with humor or false charm. How do I know you're not some kind of criminal hiding from the law? How do I know you're not running from something yourself? He countered. We're both taking risks here. The parking lot was nearly empty now, and Rebecca could see the community center staff locking up for the night. In a few minutes, she'd be alone with her car and her rapidly dwindling options. What's your real story, Daniel Walker? She asked. Not the official version, the real one. He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested the words cost him something. I used to be someone else, he said simply. Someone who lived in the world, who had a job and responsibilities and connections to other people. But that life required me to do things, to be part of things that I couldn't live with anymore. So I left. What kind of things? The kind that keep you awake at night, wondering if there was another way, if you could have made different choices. Rebecca heard the pain in his voice, the carefully controlled emotion of someone who had learned to carry guilt like a physical weight. She recognized it because she carried her own version of the same burden. I lost my job because I wouldn't keep quiet about what was happening to my students, she said quietly. Budget cuts meant larger class sizes, which meant less individual attention, which meant the kids who were already struggling fell further behind. When I complained to the administration, they said I wasn't being a team player. When I went to the school board, they said I was being disruptive. When I contacted the state education department, they said I was violating my employment contract by going outside the chain of command. So they fired you. They eliminated my position. Technically different, practically the same result. And because I'd been classified as a troublemaker, no other district would hire me. My career is over because I tried to do what was right for children. The parallel wasn't exact, but the underlying theme was the same. They were both people who had chosen principle over self-preservation and paid the price for that choice. We're quite a pair, Daniel observed with bitter humor. The disgraced teacher and the hermit with a mysterious past. What are you proposing exactly? Rebecca asked. A real marriage or just a legal document? Whatever you're comfortable with, he said. I'm not looking for romance or companionship or anything beyond mutual benefit. You'd be safe, warm, and fed. I'd have someone who could help me navigate social situations when necessary. Beyond that, we'd figure it out as we go. The snow was accumulating on her windshield now, and Rebecca could feel the cold seeping through her jacket. Tomorrow the temperature would drop even further, and her car's heater was already struggling to keep up. How long would this arrangement last? She asked. As long as it benefits both of us, Daniel replied. If you decide you want to leave, you leave. If I decide I prefer complete solitude, we end the arrangement. No hard feelings either way. It was practical, straightforward, and completely insane. It was also the best option she had. I need to think about it, she said finally. Daniel nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out a hand-drawn map. My cabin is marked here. If you decide you want to discuss this further, follow the main road about 12 miles north, then turn onto Forest Service Road 47. It's marked private, but don't let that stop you. The road gets rough after about 3 miles, but your car should make it if you're careful. And if I don't come, then you don't come, and we both figure out our problems on our own. Rebecca took the map, noting the careful detail of his drawing, the precise landmarks and warnings about difficult terrain. Why me? She asked. Why not ask someone else, someone you actually know? Daniel's smile was slight, but genuine. Because you bought my gear when nobody else would, and because you're asking the right questions instead of just saying yes out of desperation. That suggests you're smart enough to survive whatever comes next. As he turned to walk away, Rebecca called after him, "Daniel." He stopped and looked back. "What makes you think I won't just take your gear and disappear?" "Because," he said, "you're still here asking questions instead of already being gone." Rebecca watched him disappear into the darkness beyond the parking lot lights, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who knew how to navigate both wilderness and human nature. The map in her hand felt like a lifeline and a trap simultaneously, offering salvation at a price she couldn't fully calculate. The wind was picking up now, driving the snow horizontally across the empty lot, and Rebecca climbed back into her car with the knowledge that she had perhaps hours to make a decision that would reshape her entire life. She could drive south, try to find work in a larger city where her reputation hadn't preceded her. She could swallow her pride and call her sister in California, ask for help that would come with lectures and conditions and the bitter taste of acknowledged failure. Or she could follow a hand-drawn map into the Montana wilderness and trust her life to a man who read Harper Lee and understood the weight of moral compromise. As she started her car and felt the engine struggle against the cold, Rebecca Hayes realized that sometimes the most rational choice was the one that looked completely insane from the outside. The map lay folded on her passenger seat as she drove through the empty streets of Pine Ridge, past the closed school where she'd once thought she'd spend her career, past the community center where she'd been stealing moments of warmth and dignity. Tomorrow, she would have to choose between the known misery of slow starvation and exposure, or the unknown risks of a partnership with a man whose story was as mysterious as her own future. But tonight, for the first time in months, Rebecca allowed herself to imagine the possibility of being warm. Part 2. Character Foundation and Stakes. Rebecca Hayes had been sleeping in her Honda Civic for exactly 14 nights when the auctioneer's gavel changed her life. Each morning, she woke with her neck kinked from the driver's seat, her breath visible in the frigid Montana air, and the growing certainty that dignity was a luxury she could no longer afford. At 28, she possessed 2 master's degrees in education, 5 years of exemplary teaching evaluations, and exactly $19.43 to her name. The Honda's passenger seat held everything she owned that mattered: a duffel bag of clothes, a box of teaching materials she'd refused to abandon, and a folder containing rejection letters from 17 school districts across 3 states. Each rejection cited budget constraints, position eliminations, or the dreaded phrase, "not a good fit for our educational philosophy," which she'd learned was code for "we've heard about your troublemaking reputation." Pine Ridge, Montana, had never been her destination, merely a stopping point on a journey that had begun in certainty and devolved into desperation. She'd grown up in suburban Denver, the daughter of an accountant and a nurse, raised with the middle-class assumption that hard work and good intentions would be rewarded with stability and respect. Her parents had saved for her education, celebrated her acceptance into the state university's prestigious teacher preparation program, and proudly attended her graduation with dreams of grandchildren who would benefit from their daughter's noble profession. Those dreams had died slowly, eroded by budget cuts that increased class sizes from 25 students to 37, then 42, until Rebecca found herself trying to provide individual attention to children who desperately needed it while managing classroom numbers that made meaningful education nearly impossible. The breaking point had come when she discovered that Marcus Thompson, an 8-year-old with obvious learning disabilities, was being pushed through grade levels without receiving the support he needed because the school couldn't afford specialized testing. When Rebecca had requested additional resources for Marcus and 12 other struggling students, her principal had explained that such requests demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of current educational realities. When she'd persisted, documenting the children's needs and the long-term consequences of ignoring them, she'd been labeled as someone who couldn't adapt to modern teaching demands. When she'd taken her concerns to the district superintendent, she'd been told that her contract wouldn't be renewed due to her inability to work collaboratively within district guidelines. The union representative had explained with practiced sympathy that teachers who challenged administrative decisions rarely found support, especially in districts facing financial constraints. Her fellow teachers had offered private encouragement, but public silence, too concerned about their own job security to risk being associated with someone marked as problematic. Within 6 months, Rebecca had gone from Teacher of the Year nominee to unemployable pariah, her reputation preceding her to every district where she sought work. The apartment she'd shared with her roommate became unaffordable when unemployment benefits proved insufficient to cover Denver's rising rent costs. Her roommate, a nurse with steady employment and little patience for what she called self-inflicted drama, had suggested that maybe Rebecca should have kept her mouth shut about problems that weren't really her responsibility to solve. The friendship had ended the same week Rebecca loaded her car with everything she could carry and drove north towards smaller towns where her reputation might not have reached. But reputation traveled faster than Honda Civics on mountain highways, and the education community proved smaller and more connected than she'd realized. Principals in tiny Wyoming towns knew principals in Colorado suburbs, who knew superintendents in Montana counties, who all seemed to agree that Rebecca Hayes was someone who created problems rather than solving them. The fact that she'd been advocating for children's welfare became lost in the narrative of her unwillingness to accept administrative authority. Living in her car had begun as a temporary necessity, a brief bridge between her old life and whatever came next. She'd told herself it would last only until she found work, only until her next unemployment check, only until she figured out a plan that didn't involve swallowing her pride and calling her parents to admit that their investment in her education had been wasted. But temporary had stretched into 2 weeks, and 2 weeks had revealed the harsh mathematics of poverty in rural Montana. Even the cheapest motel room cost $45 a night, money she didn't have for more than a few days. The community center offered warm bathrooms during business hours, but sleeping there meant risking arrest for trespassing. The public library provided internet access for job searching, but applications required permanent addresses she didn't possess. Every potential solution required resources she lacked, creating a cycle of impossibility that tightened around her like a noose. The elementary school where she'd hoped to find work had closed permanently 3 weeks before her arrival, another casualty of state budget cuts and declining enrollment as young families moved to larger cities for economic opportunities. The building sat empty now, its playground equipment rusting in the early winter weather, a monument to the same forces that had destroyed her career in Denver. Walking past it each morning, Rebecca felt the bitter irony of her situation, a trained educator in a place desperate for educational resources, both made irrelevant by systems that valued spreadsheets over students. Pine Ridge itself reflected the economic challenges facing much of rural Montana. The lumber mill that had once employed half the town had closed 5 years earlier, taking with it not just jobs but the tax base that supported local services. Main Street showed the familiar pattern of rural decline. Empty storefronts with for lease signs faded by weather and time, businesses that had survived on the purchasing power of mill workers now struggling to serve a population increasingly dependent on disability checks and seasonal employment. The people she encountered treated her with the polite wariness reserved for obvious outsiders, their kindness tempered by the practical recognition that charity was a luxury their own circumstances rarely allowed. Mountain View Diner would let her nurse a cup of coffee for hours without complaint, but she couldn't afford to order food more than once every few days. The community center staff had stopped asking questions about why she used their restrooms so frequently, but their sympathy couldn't extend to officially allowing her to sleep in the building. Winter was approaching with the inexorable certainty of Montana weather, bringing temperatures that would transform her current discomfort into genuine life-threatening danger. The Honda's heater struggled on the coldest nights, and she'd already experienced the terror of waking to find ice formed on the inside of her windows, her breath creating crystalline patterns that spoke of how thin the margin was between survival and hypothermia. Her teaching supplies, carefully preserved through every move and setback, mocked her with their uselessness. Lesson plans for encouraging reluctant readers, art supplies for creative projects, manipulatives for teaching mathematical concepts. All the tools of a profession she could no longer practice. She'd considered selling them, but their value was almost entirely sentimental, meaningful only to someone who shared her passion for education and her belief that every child deserved individual attention and customized learning opportunities. The rejection letters had evolved in tone over the months, beginning with formal regrets about position availability and progressing to more pointed comments about her references and professional reputation. The most recent letter from a district in northern Wyoming had been brutally direct. Her former supervisor's recommendation indicated concerns about her ability to work within established hierarchies and her tendency to prioritize personal ideology over institutional goals. Reading between the lines, Rebecca understood that she'd been effectively blacklisted from the profession she'd dedicated her life to mastering. The skills that made her an exceptional teacher, her advocacy for struggling students, her willingness to challenge ineffective policies, her insistence on treating children as individuals rather than statistics, had been reframed as character. Flaws that made her unemployable. Sleep had become her enemy, not just because of the physical discomfort of spending nights cramped in a car, but because her dreams were filled with the faces of students she'd failed to save. Marcus Thompson appeared most frequently, his 8-year-old eyes bright with curiosity and frustration as he struggled with reading assignments designed for children whose brains processed information differently than his. In her dreams, she could provide him with the individual attention he needed, could access the resources that would unlock his potential, could be the teacher she'd trained to become. Waking to the reality of her powerlessness left her feeling hollow and purposeless. The community center auction had been her desperate attempt to find something, anything, that might have resale value to extend her meager resources for another few days. She'd attended hoping to find electronics or tools that might bring enough money to afford a motel room for a night or two, a temporary reprieve from the cold that would give her time to formulate a plan that didn't involve surrender. Instead, she'd found herself staring at survival gear that represented capabilities she didn't possess but desperately needed. The camping equipment spoke of self-sufficiency, of the ability to survive independently of systems that had proven unreliable. The sleeping bags were rated for temperatures far below what her car could maintain. The camping stove could provide hot meals regardless of access to kitchens. The water filtration system could ensure safe drinking water from natural sources. But more than the practical value of the equipment, she'd been drawn to what it represented about its owner. These weren't the random purchases of someone playing at outdoor adventure, but the carefully selected tools of someone who understood that survival required preparation, knowledge, and respect for the harsh realities of nature. The wear patterns on the gear suggested extensive use, but also meticulous care, the habits of someone who understood that his life might depend on the reliability of his equipment. Daniel Walker's reputation in town was built on speculation, rather than fact, fueled by the natural suspicion that isolated communities felt toward those who chose complete independence. People whispered about why a man would voluntarily separate himself from human society, creating stories that ranged from romantic notions of noble self-reliance to darker theories about criminal backgrounds or psychological instability. But Rebecca had recognized something different in the care with which his belongings had been organized, in the quality of the equipment he'd selected, in the methodical way everything had been maintained despite obvious extensive use. This was the gear of someone who approached challenges systematically, who prepared thoroughly for known dangers, who understood that survival required both physical resources and mental discipline. When her hand had risen to bid on Lot 47, she'd been acting on an instinct deeper than rational calculation. Part desperation, part intuition, part recognition that sometimes survival required trusting in possibilities that couldn't be evaluated through conventional metrics. The $20 represented her last meaningful resource, but it also represented the only potential bridge between her current circumstances and a future that might include warmth, shelter, and the possibility of moving beyond mere survival towards something that resembled living. The gear itself was worth far more than her winning bid, but its real value lay in what it might represent about the man who'd assembled it. If Daniel Walker was truly the dangerous hermit that local rumors suggested, then approaching him would be trading one form of danger for another, potentially worse form. But if he was simply someone who'd chosen independence over compromise, someone who'd found a way to survive outside systems that had proven untrustworthy, then he might understand her situation in ways that others couldn't. Standing in the community center parking lot with snowflakes beginning to accumulate on her windshield, Rebecca felt the weight of all her choices condensing into this single moment. She could drive south toward warmer climates and unknown possibilities, could swallow her pride and call family members who would help her at the cost of acknowledging complete failure, could find some other way to postpone the reckoning that winter would bring. Or she could trust in the careful handwriting she'd seen in the margins of Harper Lee, in the methodical organization of survival gear, in the possibility that sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the only one that offered genuine hope. The map in her pocket felt like both an invitation and a challenge, a test of whether she had the courage to risk everything on the chance that mutual need might create mutual salvation. As she started her car and felt the engine's reluctant response to the cold, Rebecca realized that she'd already made her choice. The question now wasn't whether to trust Daniel Walker's proposition, but whether she could find the strength to follow through on a decision that would either save her life or end it in the frozen wilderness of the Montana mountains. The drive back to her usual parking spot behind the closed grocery store gave her time to consider the practical implications of what she was contemplating. Marriage to a stranger, isolation in the wilderness, dependence on someone whose story she didn't know and whose motivations she couldn't fully understand. Every rational voice in her head screamed that the plan was insane, a desperate gamble that could easily result in her becoming another cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting too quickly. But rational voices had guided her into unemployment, homelessness, and the growing certainty that she would freeze to death in her car before winter ended. Sometimes rationality was simply another word for accepting defeat, and Rebecca Hayes had discovered reserves of stubbornness she hadn't known she possessed. If survival required irrationality, then she would embrace madness with the same determination she'd once brought to teaching reluctant readers. Part 3. The inciting incident backstory. Rebecca's hands shook as she unfolded the yellowed newspaper clipping she'd kept hidden in her teaching materials for 7 years. The headline still had the power to stop her breath. Local teacher prevents school shooting, credited with saving lives. Below it, a younger version of herself stared back from the page, her face pale but determined as she spoke to reporters about the longest 43 minutes of her life. It had happened during her second year of teaching at Millfield Elementary in Colorado, on a gray Tuesday morning that had begun like any other. She'd been reviewing multiplication tables with her third-grade class when the lockdown alarm sounded, followed immediately by the principal's voice over the intercom, using code words they'd all hoped never to hear. "Teachers, please implement code red procedures immediately. This is not a drill." Rebecca had moved with the automatic precision of someone who'd rehearsed the scenario countless times, directing her 26 students away from windows, locking her classroom door, and guiding them to the corner of the room furthest from any entrance. But training scenarios hadn't prepared her for the reality of 26 terrified 8-year-olds looking to her for protection she wasn't certain she could provide. The shooter had been Tyler Morrison, a 17-year-old former student who'd been expelled from the high school the previous month for bringing weapons to campus. His younger sister Emma was in Rebecca's class, a quiet girl who'd been struggling with reading comprehension and social anxiety since her parents' divorce. As police sirens wailed in the distance and the sound of breaking glass echoed through the building, Rebecca had watched Emma's face crumple with the terrible understanding that her brother was the source of their terror. During those endless minutes crouched in the corner, Rebecca had made decisions that would haunt her for years afterward. When Emma began hyperventilating, Rebecca had held her close, whispering reassurances she didn't believe while trying to keep the other children calm. When Tyler's voice echoed through the hallway, calling for his sister, Rebecca had faced an impossible choice between following protocol and following her heart. The official lockdown procedure was clear: remain hidden, keep students quiet, wait for law enforcement to resolve the situation. But Emma's distress was escalating, and Rebecca could hear Tyler's voice growing more agitated as he moved through the building. She understood, with the intuition that sometimes guides teachers in crisis moments, that Tyler wasn't looking to hurt his sister, but to protect her from something, possibly from the consequences of his own actions. Against every regulation and her own survival instincts, Rebecca had unlocked her classroom door and stepped into the hallway, leaving her students in the care of her teaching assistant while she went to confront an armed teenager whose mental state was completely unknown. The decision was insane, indefensible, and absolutely necessary. She'd found Tyler 3 classrooms down, his face streaked with tears and a handgun hanging loosely at his side as he called Emma's name with increasing desperation. When he'd seen Rebecca, his first reaction had been relief rather than aggression. "Miss Hayes," he'd said, his voice breaking with emotion, "I need to talk to Emma. I need to tell her I'm sorry." Rebecca had recognized something in his tone, a desperation that spoke of goodbye rather than violence, of someone who'd reached the end of his ability to cope with circumstances beyond his control. She'd approached him with the same careful attention she used with her most troubled students, speaking in the calm voice she'd perfected for de-escalating classroom conflicts. "Tyler," she'd said, "Emma is safe and she loves you. But right now, you're scaring her and all the other children. If you really want to help her, you need to put the gun down and let me help you figure this out." What followed was a conversation that lasted 37 minutes according to the police timeline, though it felt like hours to Rebecca. Tyler had poured out a story of bullying, family dysfunction, and the crushing weight of expectations he felt unable to meet. His plan hadn't been to hurt anyone at the elementary school, but to make a statement about the high school's failure to protect him from systematic harassment, with the elementary school serving as a location where he thought he could control the situation without causing actual harm. The gun, Rebecca learned, had never been loaded. Tyler had wanted to create a crisis that would force people to pay attention to his suffering, but he'd lacked both the intention and the courage to actually hurt anyone. He'd been a desperate child playing with symbols of power he didn't understand, and Rebecca had talked him through the surrender that saved both his life and the lives of everyone in the building. The aftermath had been complex and politically charged. Rebecca was simultaneously hailed as a hero for her courage and criticized by school district officials for violating lockdown protocols that existed to protect both students and staff. The media attention had been overwhelming, thrusting her into a spotlight she'd never sought and didn't know how to navigate. But the real impact had been on her understanding of education and her role as a teacher. Tyler Morrison had been a student who'd fallen through the cracks of a system more focused on test scores than emotional wellness, a child whose obvious distress signals had been ignored until they escalated into a crisis that could have ended in tragedy. His story had reinforced Rebecca's belief that teaching meant more than academic instruction, that educators had a responsibility to see and respond to the whole child, not just their performance on standardized assessments. The newspaper clipping represented the moment when Rebecca's teaching philosophy had crystallized into an uncompromising commitment to student advocacy. She'd understood that children like Tyler and Emma Morrison existed in every classroom, that her job wasn't just to teach reading and mathematics, but to recognize when students were struggling with challenges that threatened their ability to learn and grow. This understanding had made her a more effective teacher, but also a more troublesome employee. She'd become someone who asked uncomfortable questions about resource allocation, who pushed for mental health support for struggling students, who refused to accept that some children were simply destined to fail. Her success in the classroom was undeniable, but her willingness to challenge administrative priorities had made her a target for supervisors who preferred compliance to advocacy. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same instincts that had made her a local hero during the school shooting crisis had eventually led to her unemployment and homelessness. The courage to step into danger for the sake of children had been celebrated when it involved confronting an armed teenager, but condemned when it involved confronting educational bureaucracy. Now, sitting in her car with snow accumulating on the windshield, Rebecca found parallels between her current situation and that terrible Tuesday 7 years ago. Once again, she was facing a choice between safety and principle, between following conventional wisdom and trusting her instincts about what was right. The stakes were different but equally high. Instead of protecting her students from physical danger, she was protecting herself from the slow death of freezing poverty. Daniel Walker's proposition felt like another moment of stepping into the unknown, of making a decision that couldn't be justified through normal risk assessment, but that felt necessary on a deeper level. Just as she'd recognized something salvageable in Tyler Morrison's desperation, she'd sensed something trustworthy in Daniel's careful way of speaking, in his honest acknowledgement of the risks they would both be taking. The newspaper clipping served as a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the most necessary one, that survival often required moving toward danger rather than away from it. Rebecca had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear when action was required to protect something precious. What felt precious now wasn't just her own life, though survival was certainly part of her motivation. It was the possibility that she might find a way to rebuild an existence that included purpose and dignity, that allowed her to be useful rather than simply desperate. Daniel's proposition offered not just shelter from the Montana winter, but the chance to be needed rather than merely tolerated. She'd spent months feeling like a burden on every system that provided minimal assistance, apologizing for taking up space in community centers and libraries, grateful for charity that came with the implicit understanding that she was failing to manage her own life adequately. The prospect of entering into a partnership where her contributions were valued, where her presence solved problems rather than creating them, offered a form of salvation that went beyond mere physical survival. The parallels to her teaching career were obvious. Just as she'd found purpose in helping struggling students find their potential, she might find renewal in helping an isolated man navigate the social connections that her background and training had prepared her to manage. The skills that had made her effective in parent conferences and administrative meetings, her ability to build bridges between different personalities and perspectives, could be exactly what Daniel needed to maintain his independence while meeting whatever legal or social obligations required him to appear more conventional. Rebecca understood isolation in ways that few people could. Her months of unemployment and homelessness had taught her what it meant to exist outside normal social structures, to be someone whose presence made others uncomfortable, who was tolerated rather than welcomed. She knew the exhaustion of constantly managing other people's perceptions, of trying to appear stable and competent when internal reality was chaos and desperation. If Daniel Walker had chosen isolation over compromise, if he'd found peace in solitude that he couldn't find in conventional society, then he might understand her own complex relationship with systems that claimed to help but often seemed designed to maintain the status quo regardless of individual cost. They might both be refugees from different forms of institutional failure, finding common ground in their shared understanding that sometimes survival required stepping outside accepted boundaries. The snow was falling more heavily now, and Rebecca could feel the temperature dropping as evening approached. Her usual parking spot behind the grocery store would be cold and miserable, another night of broken sleep interrupted by the need to run the engine for heat, another morning of stiff joints, and the growing fear that each day brought her closer to the point where her aging car would simply refuse to start in the sub-zero temperatures. The alternative was a hand-drawn map leading to possibilities she couldn't evaluate, a partnership with a man whose story she didn't know, a legal commitment that would either save her life or make her disappearance easier to cover up. Every rational consideration argued against following that map, but Rebecca had learned to distrust purely rational thinking. Rationality had told her to keep quiet about Marcus Thompson's learning disabilities, to accept class sizes that made individual attention impossible, to prioritize job security over student advocacy. Her hand moved instinctively to the newspaper clipping, feeling the soft edges of paper that had been folded and unfolded countless times. The young woman in the photograph had made an impossible choice and somehow found the strength to see it through. 7 years later, facing another impossible choice, Rebecca wondered if she still possessed that same courage, if she could once again step into the unknown for the sake of survival and principle. The decision felt inevitable, not because it was safe or smart, but because it was the only choice that offered genuine hope rather than merely delayed defeat. Just as she'd unlocked her classroom door to face Tyler Morrison, she would follow Daniel Walker's map into the Montana wilderness, trusting that sometimes the most dangerous path was also the only one that led to salvation. Starting her car, Rebecca felt the engine's reluctant response to the cold and recognized it as a metaphor for her own situation. Like the Honda, she was operating at the limits of her capacity, requiring more resources than were available, struggling to maintain basic function under increasingly challenging conditions. Unlike the car, she still had choices to make, decisions that could lead either to breakdown or breakthrough. The map seemed to pulse with possibility as she drove through Pine Ridge's empty streets, past the closed school and shuttered businesses that told their own stories of dreams deferred and systems failed. Tomorrow, she would either find sanctuary in the mountains or add her own story to the catalog of people who'd vanished trying to escape circumstances they couldn't control. But tonight, for the first time in months, Rebecca Hayes fell asleep with something resembling hope. Her dreams filled not with the faces of students she'd failed to save, but with the possibility that salvation sometimes came disguised as danger. And that courage was simply the decision to keep moving forward even when the destination remained unknown. Part 4. The legend and motivation. Rebecca's dreams that night were filled with fire and shadows, memories bleeding into imagination as her subconscious wrestled with the decision that morning would demand. She found herself back in her childhood bedroom in Denver, 8 years old and hiding under covers while her parents argued in hushed tones about money, about choices, about the kind of future they could provide for their only daughter. Her father's voice had carried the weight of someone who understood that hard work didn't guarantee security, that doing everything right could still lead to financial catastrophe when medical bills exceeded insurance coverage and steady employment proved less steady than anyone had planned. Her mother's responses had been sharp with the fear that came from watching dreams crumble under the relentless pressure of circumstances beyond their control. Those late-night conversations had shaped Rebecca's understanding that safety was an illusion, that the systems people trusted to provide stability could disappear without warning, leaving families to navigate crises with inadequate resources and no clear path forward. She'd learned early that survival often required choices that couldn't be evaluated through conventional measures of right and wrong, that sometimes the best available option was simply the one that led away from immediate danger. The lesson had been reinforced throughout her childhood as she watched her parents rebuild their lives after her father's heart attack derailed his accounting career and her mother's return to nursing stretched family resources to their breaking point. She'd seen them make decisions that prioritized practical necessity over personal preference, that valued stability over happiness, that chose endurance over fulfillment because endurance was the only luxury their circumstances allowed. By the time Rebecca had graduated from high school, she'd understood that security was something you created through careful preparation and willingness to adapt to changing circumstances. Her choice to become a teacher had been motivated partly by genuine love of learning and children, but also by the practical recognition that education was one of the few professions that offered both personal meaning and reliable employment, with benefits that could support a middle-class lifestyle. The irony of her current situation wasn't lost on her. She'd chosen teaching specifically because it seemed safe, stable, protected by unions and tenure systems that promised career security. In exchange for competent service, she'd followed all the rules, earned advanced degrees, maintained excellent evaluations, built relationships with colleagues and administrators that should have protected her from the kind of arbitrary termination that destroyed careers. But she'd learned that even the most carefully constructed safety nets could prove inadequate when institutional priorities shifted. Budget cuts had eliminated positions that had seemed permanent. Political pressures had redefined teaching effectiveness in ways that marginalized her strengths, and her commitment to student advocacy had been reframed as inability to adapt to changing educational realities. The months of unemployment had stripped away her remaining illusions about the reliability of conventional systems. Unemployment benefits had proven insufficient to maintain housing costs in Denver's increasingly expensive market. Job search. Resources had been designed for people seeking work in stable industries with predictable hiring patterns, not for teachers whose profession was being systematically undermined by political and economic forces beyond their control. Even charity had proven unreliable, dependent on volunteer availability and funding that fluctuated based on donor priorities and economic conditions. The community center that provided her only access to warm bathrooms and internet connectivity operated on limited hours with overworked staff who couldn't address the growing population of people whose circumstances had deteriorated beyond their ability to manage independently. Rebecca had discovered that homelessness wasn't just about lacking shelter, but about losing access to the basic infrastructure that made employment possible. Without a permanent address, she couldn't establish banking relationships that many employers required. Without regular access to showers and laundry facilities, She couldn't maintain the professional appearance that interviews demanded. Without reliable internet and phone service, she couldn't respond promptly to the few job opportunities that emerged. Each barrier had created additional barriers, establishing a cycle of impossibility that grew stronger with each passing day. The longer she remained unemployed, the harder it became to explain the gaps in her employment history. The more desperate her circumstances became, the less attractive she appeared to potential employers who could afford to be selective. The more isolated she became from professional networks, the fewer opportunities emerged that matched her qualifications and experience. Living in her car had become a master class in the hidden costs of poverty. Every decision required calculations that people with stable housing never considered. Should she use precious gasoline to drive to a job interview that would cost more in transportation than she could afford to lose if the position didn't materialize? Should she spend money on professional clothes that might improve her interview prospects, but would leave her unable to afford food for several days? The community center auction had represented her last attempt to find conventional solutions to her problems. She'd hoped to discover something valuable enough to sell, something that might provide a brief financial cushion that could be leveraged into more stable circumstances. Instead, she'd found herself bidding on survival gear with her last $20, making a choice that abandoned traditional problem-solving in favor of possibilities she couldn't evaluate. Daniel Walker's proposition had felt like recognition from someone who understood that conventional solutions sometimes proved inadequate, that survival could require partnerships that made no sense according to normal social expectations. His offer had been practical rather than romantic, acknowledging that both of them had problems that traditional support systems had failed to address. The more Rebecca considered his proposal, the more it seemed like a reasonable response to unreasonable circumstances. Marriage for mutual benefit wasn't uncommon throughout history, and her current situation had moved far beyond the luxury of making decisions based purely on emotional preference. She needed shelter, protection, and the kind of legal stability that could provide a foundation for rebuilding her life. He apparently needed social legitimacy and someone who could help him navigate interactions with conventional society. The arrangement would give her time to recover from the trauma of unemployment and homelessness, to regain her health and confidence, to develop new strategies for finding work that didn't depend on references from supervisors who'd marked her as problematic. It would provide her with a permanent address, access to basic amenities, and the psychological security of knowing that she wouldn't freeze to death in her car during the Montana winter. In exchange, she could offer skills that her teaching background had developed: the ability to communicate effectively with diverse groups of people, experience managing complex social dynamics, comfort with educational and governmental bureaucracy, and the kind of professional presence that could make a hermit appear more conventional when necessary. The partnership wouldn't require her to pretend affection she didn't feel or to accept romantic advances she didn't want. It would be a business arrangement between two adults who discovered that their individual problems might have mutual solutions. The legal marriage would provide protection for both of them, ensuring that their arrangement had official recognition and that neither could be exploited by the other without legal recourse. Rebecca understood that the proposition involved considerable risk. Daniel Walker was essentially a stranger whose reputation in town was built on speculation rather than fact. She would be isolating herself in a remote location with limited ability to seek help if the arrangement proved dangerous or unsatisfactory. She would be legally binding herself to someone whose motivations and background remained largely unknown. But the alternatives carried equal or greater risks. Continuing to live in her car through a Montana winter would likely result in death from exposure or hypothermia. Returning to Denver would mean swallowing her pride and accepting charity from family members who'd already made their opinions clear about her poor decision-making. Moving to another state would require resources she didn't possess and would likely result in the same cycle of rejection and poverty she'd experienced in Colorado. The newspaper clipping from 7 years ago reminded her that she'd already proven capable of making decisions that appeared irrational but were actually necessary responses to impossible situations. Confronting Tyler Morrison in that school hallway had violated every protocol designed to keep her safe, but it had also prevented a tragedy that could have destroyed dozens of lives. Sometimes courage meant moving toward danger rather than away from it. especially when all available options carried significant risks. Rebecca's teaching experience had given her confidence in her ability to read people's character and motivations. She'd learned to recognize the difference between children who were genuinely dangerous and those who were simply struggling with circumstances beyond their control. She'd developed instincts about when to trust and when to be cautious, when to offer help and when to maintain boundaries. Daniel Walker's manner of speaking, his acknowledgement of the risks they would both be taking, his honest presentation of the arrangement as mutual necessity rather than romantic opportunity, all suggested someone who approached problems systematically rather than impulsively. His reading of Harper Lee indicated educational background and moral complexity that contradicted the image of a dangerous hermit that local rumors had created. Most importantly, his proposal offered her the chance to be useful rather than simply desperate. After months of feeling like a burden on every system that provided minimal assistance, the prospect of entering into a partnership where her contributions were valued represented a form of psychological salvation that went beyond mere physical survival. The teaching skills that had made her unemployable in conventional educational settings, her willingness to advocate for individuals against institutional inertia, her refusal to accept that some problems were simply unsolvable, might be exactly what Daniel needed to maintain his independence while meeting whatever social or legal obligations required him to appear more conventional. As dawn approached and Rebecca prepared to make her final decision, she realized that she'd already chosen her path. The map in her pocket represented not just directions to Daniel Walker's cabin, but a route toward reclaiming agency in her own life. Instead of remaining trapped in cycles of poverty and rejection that she couldn't control, she would be taking active steps toward a future that included possibilities rather than merely delayed catastrophe. The snow had stopped falling during the night, leaving Pine Ridge covered in a pristine white blanket that made everything appear clean and new. Rebecca took it as a positive sign, an indication that sometimes transformation was possible, that even the most damaged landscapes could be renewed under the right conditions. Starting her car for what might be the last time as a homeless woman, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in months, anticipation rather than dread about what the day might bring. She was about to embark on an adventure that couldn't be evaluated through conventional risk assessment, trusting her life to possibilities that existed beyond the boundaries of normal social expectations. But as she'd learned during the school shooting crisis, sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the only one that offered genuine hope. Sometimes survival required stepping into the unknown with nothing but faith that courage and careful judgment would be sufficient to navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. The map felt warm in her pocket as she drove through Pine Ridge's quiet streets, past the symbols of conventional life that had proven inadequate to protect her from the harsh realities of economic displacement. Behind her lay months of desperation and slowly diminishing options. Ahead lay possibilities that couldn't be predicted but that offered at least the chance of transformation rather than merely continued endurance. Rebecca Hayes was about to discover whether the same instincts that had made her an exceptional teacher and gotten her fired from her career would also guide her safely through the most unconventional decision of her life. Part 5. The fateful decision. The morning sun painted the Montana peaks in shades of rose and gold as Rebecca sat in her car outside Mountain View Diner. Daniel Walker's map spread across her steering wheel like a contract waiting to be signed. She'd been awake since 4 o'clock, her mind cycling through possibilities and consequences until exhaustion had given way to a strange kind of clarity that felt both terrifying and liberating. Inside the diner, she could see the early shift beginning their routines, servers preparing coffee for the handful of customers who gathered each morning to discuss weather, local politics, and the slowly diminishing prospects of a town that had never quite recovered from the mill closure. She recognized some of the faces from her weeks of nursing single cups of coffee, people who'd shown her small kindnesses without asking uncomfortable questions about why an educated woman was obviously living in her car. Martha Collins emerged from the diner's kitchen, her gray hair pulled back in the practical bun she'd worn for the 30 years she'd been serving breakfast to Pine Ridge's early risers. She spotted Rebecca through the window and waved with the kind of genuine warmth that made the gesture feel like an invitation rather than mere politeness. Martha had been one of the few people in town who treated Rebecca like a temporary visitor rather than a permanent problem, always ready with a refill of coffee and the kind of casual conversation that helped maintain the illusion of normalcy. Rebecca folded the map carefully and stepped out of her car, feeling the bite of morning air that promised another day of temperatures that would challenge her Honda's struggling heater. The decision felt inevitable now, not because it was safe or smart, but because it was the only choice that offered genuine transformation rather than merely postponed defeat. The diner's warmth enveloped her like an embrace as she pushed through the door, the familiar sense of bacon and fresh coffee, providing a momentary comfort that made her chest tighten with something that might have been nostalgia for a life she'd never actually lived. The other customers nodded acknowledgement of her presence with the reserved friendliness that small towns extended to outsiders who'd proven themselves harmless but hadn't yet earned full acceptance. "Morning, honey," Martha called from behind the counter, already reaching for the coffee pot with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd memorized every customer's preferences. "You're up early today. Got somewhere important to be?" The question was casual, but Rebecca heard the underlying concern of someone who'd watched her situation deteriorate over the past 2 weeks. Martha had probably guessed that Rebecca was living in her car, but small-town politeness prevented direct inquiries about circumstances that might embarrass everyone involved. "Actually, I do," Rebecca replied, settling onto her usual stool at the counter. "I'm going to visit someone about a job opportunity." It wasn't exactly a lie, though it simplified the reality in ways that would have made the truth sound like the beginning of a cautionary tale. Martha's face brightened with the kind of genuine pleasure that came from hearing good news about someone whose struggles had been obvious but unspoken. "That's wonderful, dear. Anyone local?" "Daniel Walker," Rebecca said, watching Martha's expression shift from pleasure to surprise to something that might have been concern. "The mountain man?" Martha set down the coffee pot with more force than necessary, the ceramic making a sharp sound against the counter. "Honey, are you sure that's wise? I mean, he seems harmless enough the few times he comes to town, but living way up in those mountains all alone, well, it makes people wonder." "Wonder about what?" Martha glanced around the diner, ensuring that their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the other customers, then leaned closer with the conspiratorial tone reserved for sharing information that walked the line between concern and gossip. "Nobody really knows his story," she said quietly. "He showed up here about 5 years ago, bought that old mining claim up on Forest Service Road 47, and just disappeared into the wilderness. Pays his taxes in cash, buys supplies in town maybe twice a year, polite enough, but never volunteers information about himself." That sounds like someone who values privacy, not necessarily someone dangerous. "Maybe," Martha agreed reluctantly. "But there's privacy, and then there's isolation that makes people wonder what someone's hiding from. Sheriff Bradley's always been curious about him. Says a man doesn't choose to live that far from civilization unless he's got reasons that won't stand up to scrutiny." Rebecca felt a familiar stirring of defensive instinct, the same protective response she'd felt when administrators had questioned her advocacy for struggling students. Has he ever done anything to suggest he's dangerous? Threatened anyone? Caused problems? Broken any laws? "No," Martha admitted. "Can't say that he has. It's just that in a town this size, people like to know something about their neighbors, and Daniel Walker keeps his cards closer to his chest than most folks are comfortable with." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Tom Bradley himself, his bulk filling the diner's doorway as he stamped snow from his boots and surveyed the morning customers with the automatic alertness of someone whose job required constant awareness of potential problems. His gaze lingered on Rebecca with the kind of attention that suggested he'd been thinking about her situation and might have opinions about appropriate solutions. "Morning, Martha," he said, settling onto a stool 2 spaces down from Rebecca, with the careful positioning of someone who wanted to appear casual while maintaining the ability to observe and intervene if necessary. "Coffee when you get a chance, Sheriff," Martha replied, her tone carrying the respectful familiarity of someone who'd served coffee to 3 generations of local law enforcement. She poured his coffee with practiced efficiency, then found reasons to busy herself with tasks that kept her within earshot of their conversation. "Miss Hayes," Bradley said after taking a sip of coffee that was probably too hot to drink comfortably. Haven't seen you around much lately. Everything all right? The question was loaded with implications that Rebecca couldn't quite decode. Was he offering help, expressing suspicion, or simply making conversation? Her months of unemployment had made her hypersensitive to the subtle ways people communicated judgments about her circumstances and choices. I'm fine, Sheriff. Actually, I was just telling Martha that I have a job interview today. Is that right? His eyebrows rose with interest that felt more professional than personal. Anyone I know? Daniel Walker. The change in Bradley's expression was immediate and significant. His coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, and Rebecca could see him processing the information with the systematic attention he probably brought to evaluating potential problems. Daniel Walker, he repeated slowly. Now that's interesting. May I ask what kind of work he's offered you? Rebecca felt the weight of the diner's attention settling upon their conversation. The other customers had stopped their own discussions to listen, and Martha had abandoned all pretense of being busy with other tasks. She realized that her answer would become part of Pine Ridge's collective knowledge about both herself and Daniel Walker, shared and analyzed in ways that would shape how both of them were perceived by the community. Household management, she said finally, choosing words that were technically accurate while avoiding details that would invite more questions than she was prepared to answer. Cooking, cleaning, helping with correspondence and paperwork. It was close enough to the truth that she could say it without feeling dishonest, though it omitted the marriage proposal that was the central component of Daniel's offer. Bradley's expression suggested that he wasn't entirely convinced by her explanation, but he couldn't identify any specific reason to probe deeper. Miss Hayes, he said carefully, I hope you understand that Daniel Walker is something of an unknown quantity around here. Seems harmless enough, but living in complete isolation like he does, well, it can change a person in ways that aren't always predictable. Are you saying he's dangerous? I'm saying he's unpredictable, which amounts to the same thing when you're talking about a woman going to live alone with a man nobody really knows anything about. The paternalistic tone rankled, reminiscent of the attitudes she'd encountered from school administrators who'd questioned her judgment about student advocacy. Sheriff, I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about employment opportunities. I'm sure you are, Bradley replied with the kind of diplomatic agreement that avoided direct confrontation while maintaining his position. I'm just suggesting that it might be wise to take some precautions. Maybe arrange for regular check-ins. Make sure someone knows where you'll be and when to expect contact from you. The suggestion was reasonable and probably motivated by genuine concern, but it also carried implications about her judgment and Daniel's character that made Rebecca's defensive instincts flare. She'd spent months being treated like someone whose circumstances proved poor decision-making, whose desperation made her vulnerable to exploitation, whose situation required others to manage her choices for her protection. I'll certainly keep that in mind, she said with the kind of polite firmness that indicated the conversation was over. Bradley nodded with the resigned expression of someone who'd offered advice that wouldn't be followed, then returned his attention to his coffee and the morning newspaper that Martha had thoughtfully placed beside his cup. The other customers gradually resumed their own conversations, though Rebecca could feel the residual attention that indicated her plans would be discussed long after she left the diner. Martha refilled Rebecca's coffee cup with movements that conveyed sympathy for the difficult position she'd been placed in by the sheriff's questions. Don't mind Tom, she said quietly. He means well, but he's got a protective streak that sometimes comes out as suspicion of anyone who doesn't fit standard patterns. I appreciate the warning, Rebecca replied, though she wasn't entirely certain whether Martha was referring to the sheriff's suspicions of Daniel Walker or his concerns about her own judgment. As she finished her coffee and prepared to leave, Rebecca found herself thinking about the dynamics of small-town life that she'd never fully understood during her years in suburban Denver. Here, everyone's business was considered community property, and individual choices were evaluated according to their potential impact on collective welfare. Privacy was viewed with suspicion, and deviation from accepted norms required justification that satisfied social expectations as well as personal needs. Daniel Walker's 5 years of isolation had made him a figure of speculation rather than acceptance, his refusal to share his story interpreted as evidence of secrets worth hiding. Her own desperate circumstances had marked her as someone whose Judgment might be compromised by necessity, whose choices required community oversight to prevent outcomes that could reflect poorly on Pine Ridge's collective character. The irony was that both she and Daniel were probably seeking the same thing: the freedom to live according to their own definitions of what constituted a successful life, without having to justify their choices to people whose approval they'd never requested. Her months of homelessness had taught her that conventional social expectations were luxuries available only to people whose circumstances provided sufficient stability to make long-term planning possible. Daniel's proposition offered her the chance to step outside the cycle of poverty and rejection that had trapped her in increasingly desperate circumstances. The marriage arrangement would provide legal protections and social legitimacy that could serve as a foundation for rebuilding her life according to her own priorities rather than the expectations of systems that had proven unreliable. As she walked back to her car, Rebecca felt the weight of Pine Ridge's collective attention following her progress across the parking lot. She understood that her decision to visit Daniel Walker would become part of the town's ongoing narrative about both of them, analyzed and discussed in ways that would influence future interactions with community members whose approval might matter for practical reasons. But she also understood that seeking that approval had become a luxury she couldn't afford. The choice between social acceptance and physical survival wasn't really a choice at all, and the people whose opinions might be affected by her decision weren't the ones who would suffer the consequences if she made the socially acceptable choice to continue sleeping in her car through a Montana winter. The Honda started reluctantly, its engine protesting the cold with sounds that suggested mechanical systems pushed beyond their designed limits. Rebecca listened to the irregular idle and calculated how many more cold starts the aging vehicle might tolerate before refusing to function entirely. The timeline for her decision was being dictated by factors beyond her control, mechanical realities that wouldn't wait for social approval or conventional courtship rituals. Forest Service Road 47 appeared exactly where Daniel's map indicated, marked by a weathered sign that warned of unpaved conditions and winter closure dates that had already passed. The road itself looked more like a suggestion than an actual route, disappearing into wilderness that seemed designed to discourage casual visitors. Rebecca engaged the Honda's all-wheel drive system and committed to a journey that would either end in partnership or disaster, with limited middle ground between those possibilities. The first few miles were manageable, the road following gentle grades through stands of pine and aspen that created a cathedral-like atmosphere of natural beauty and profound silence. But as the elevation increased and the trees grew thicker, the road deteriorated into a series of challenges that tested both her driving skills and her car's mechanical capabilities. Ruts deep enough to scrape her oil pan forced her to navigate with careful attention to wheel placement, while rocks and fallen branches required constant vigilance to avoid damage that would leave her stranded miles from any help. The Honda's engine labored in the thin air, its automatic transmission hunting for appropriate gears as steep grades demanded more power than the aging vehicle could comfortably provide. After 45 minutes of careful driving, Rebecca began to question whether her map-reading skills were adequate for the challenge. The route seemed to branch and reconnect in ways that didn't match Daniel's careful drawings, and several times she was forced to backtrack when what appeared to be the main road revealed itself as a dead-end logging trail or abandoned mining access. The forest around her grew more dense and primitive as she climbed higher into the mountains, the trees larger and the undergrowth thicker, creating an environment that felt untouched by human activity except for the barely maintained road she was following. The silence was absolute except for her engine's struggle, a quiet so complete that it seemed to have weight and texture. When she finally emerged into a clearing that contained Daniel Walker's cabin, Rebecca's first reaction was surprise at how thoroughly civilized the setting appeared. She'd expected something crude and makeshift, a shelter that reflected the desperate improvisation of someone hiding from society. Instead, she found a structure that spoke of careful planning and skilled craftsmanship, designed for comfort and permanence rather than mere survival. The cabin itself was larger than she'd anticipated, built from logs that had been carefully selected and fitted with the precision of someone who understood that his life might depend on the building's ability to withstand extreme weather. Solar panels gleamed on the south-facing roof, and a substantial woodpile spoke of preparation for winter heating that went far beyond optimistic hoping. A generator shed sat discreetly behind the main building, its presence suggesting backup power. Systems that could maintain essential functions during extended periods of cloudy weather or equipment failure. Gardens protected by deer fencing showed evidence of systematic food production, while a well-maintained greenhouse indicated year-round growing capabilities that could provide fresh vegetables regardless of season. The overall impression was of someone who'd approached wilderness living with the same methodical planning that might characterize a suburban homeowner, but with the added complexity of complete self-sufficiency in an environment where mistakes could prove fatal. This wasn't the desperate shelter of someone running from problems, but the carefully constructed refuge of someone who'd chosen independence over compromise. Daniel emerged from the cabin as she parked, moving with the same careful deliberation she'd observed at the community center. He wore work clothes that suggested he'd been engaged in some form of physical labor, but his attention was focused entirely on her arrival with an intensity that spoke of how significant this moment was for both of them. "You came," he said, as she stepped out of her car, and Rebecca heard both relief and surprise in his voice. "I did," she replied, suddenly aware of how final her decision felt now that she was actually standing in his clearing. "Though I'm not entirely sure why. Because you're brave enough to take calculated risks when the alternatives are worse than the unknowns," he said with the kind of insight that suggested he'd given considerable thought to her circumstances and motivations. Rebecca looked around the clearing, taking in the evidence of his competence and preparation, the obvious care with which he'd constructed not just shelter, but a life that functioned independently of systems that had proven unreliable. For both of them. "This isn't what I expected," she admitted. "What did you expect? Something more desperate, I suppose. More like what someone fleeing from problems might create." Daniel's smile carried a hint of humor that transformed his stern features in ways that made him appear both younger and more approachable. "Maybe I am fleeing from problems. Maybe I just chose to flee toward solutions rather than away from consequences." The distinction felt important, though Rebecca wasn't entirely certain why. She understood that she was seeing evidence of someone who'd made the transition from surviving day-to-day to building something sustainable, from reacting to circumstances to creating circumstances that served his purposes. "Your map was very accurate," she said, gesturing toward the Honda that had somehow managed to navigate the challenging road despite her doubts about its capabilities. "I wanted to make sure you could find me if you decided to come. But I also wanted to make sure the journey was difficult enough that you'd have time to change your mind if you were going to. And if I had changed my mind, then you would have turned around, and we both would have figured out our problems independently." The matter-of-fact tone suggested that he'd genuinely been prepared for either outcome, that his proposition had been offered without expectations that would have made her refusal a personal rejection. Rebecca found his lack of pressure reassuring. Evidence that their potential partnership would be built on mutual choice rather than emotional manipulation. "Can I see the inside?" she asked. Of course. The cabin's interior reinforced her impression of careful planning and skilled execution. The main room combined kitchen, dining, and living areas in an open design that made the space feel larger than its actual square footage, while a stone fireplace provided both warmth and the comfortable focal point that made the space feel like a home rather than merely shelter. The kitchen was fully functional with propane appliances, a hand-pumped well water system, and storage that suggested someone who planned meals systematically rather than simply opening whatever cans happened to be available. Bookshelves lined two walls, filled with volumes that ranged from practical manuals on wilderness survival and sustainable living to literature and philosophy that indicated someone who valued intellectual engagement as well as physical comfort. A loft area contained what appeared to be sleeping quarters, while a separate room housed an office space with communication equipment and filing systems that suggested someone who maintained connections to the outside world despite his physical isolation. The overall impression was of someone who'd created not just a retreat from society, but a base of operations that could support whatever activities required his attention. "This is remarkable," Rebecca said, meaning it sincerely. "How long did it take you to build all this?" 3 years for the basic structure, and I'm still making improvements. It's become something of an ongoing project." "You did all this yourself?" "Most of it. I hired help for a few specialized tasks that required equipment I didn't own, but I wanted to understand every system so I could maintain and repair everything independently. The cabin spoke of skills and knowledge that went far beyond what she'd expected from someone whose reputation was built on isolation and mystery. Daniel Walker had clearly approached wilderness living as a complex engineering challenge, systematically developing the capabilities required for complete self-sufficiency. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. The space felt warm and welcoming, in ways that made her realize how much she'd missed the simple comfort of being indoors, of having walls that provided genuine protection from the elements. "It's also lonely," Daniel said quietly. "I built it for one person, but I've learned that some aspects of life work better with partnership." The admission felt like an invitation to discuss the practical details of his proposition, the specifics of how their arrangement might function on a day-to-day basis. Rebecca settled into one of the comfortable chairs near the fireplace, feeling genuinely warm for the first time in weeks. "Tell me about your situation," she said. "The real situation that makes you need a wife for legitimacy." Daniel poured coffee from a pot that had been keeping warm on the wood stove, then settled into the chair across from her with the careful positioning of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. "5 years ago, I inherited this property from my grandfather," he began. "Along with the land came some complications that I'm still working to resolve. There are mineral rights issues, questions about water usage, and some boundary disputes with adjacent landowners who'd prefer to see this property sold to developers rather than maintained as wilderness. And marriage would help with those issues. How? Married landowners are viewed differently by courts and county officials than single men who live in isolation. A wife suggests stability, community ties, the kind of conventional lifestyle that makes people comfortable with someone. Controlling significant natural resources." "What kind of natural resources?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, and Rebecca could see him weighing how much information to share, calculating the balance between honesty and discretion that their partnership would require. "Water rights, primarily. The spring that feeds my well also supplies several seasonal streams that flow into the main watershed. During drought years, those rights become valuable enough that people get creative about legal challenges." "And the mineral rights?" "Copper, possibly some rare earth elements. Nothing that's been fully surveyed, but enough potential to make certain parties interested in forcing a sale." Rebecca was beginning to understand the complexity of his situation. He wasn't just a hermit seeking social legitimacy, but someone managing significant assets that could attract unwanted attention from people with resources to mount serious legal challenges. Why not just sell? Take the money and relocate somewhere less complicated? Daniel's expression suggested that the question touched on issues more complex than simple financial calculations. "Because some things are worth more than their monetary value. This land has been in my family for 4 generations. My grandfather trusted me to preserve it, not liquidate it for immediate profit." The answer revealed motivations that went beyond personal comfort or convenience, suggesting someone who felt obligations that couldn't be satisfied through purely selfish choices. Rebecca recognized the conflict between practical necessity and moral obligation, having faced her own version of the same dilemma when choosing between job security and student advocacy. "And you think having a wife would protect the property? How exactly?" Married couples have stronger legal standing in property disputes, especially when the wife has professional credentials that suggest community involvement. A teacher married to a landowner looks like a family committed to long-term residence, not a hermit hoarding resources. The logic was pragmatic rather than romantic, based on legal realities rather than emotional needs. Rebecca found his honesty refreshing after months of dealing with social service workers and potential employers who'd offered help that came with conditions they hadn't been willing to discuss directly. "What would my actual responsibilities be?" "Helping me navigate interactions with county officials, lawyers, and anyone else who needs to believe I'm a stable member of the community rather than an eccentric recluse. Attending social functions, when necessary, providing character references if legal challenges arise, basically being visible evidence that I have normal human connections. And in exchange, you'd have a warm, comfortable home, plenty of food, access to communication systems, and legal protection as my wife. Plus whatever resources you need to rebuild your career when you're ready to do that." The offer was generous enough to seem almost too good to be true, which made Rebecca wonder what aspects of the arrangement he might not be sharing. "What aren't you telling me about this situation?" Daniel's slight smile suggested that he'd expected the question and respected her for asking it. The legal challenges could become serious enough to require court appearances, depositions, potentially months of dealing with lawyers and bureaucrats who see this property as an obstacle to development projects they consider more important than wilderness preservation. "And you think my presence would help with that?" "I think your background in education would give you credibility with judges and officials who might view a single landowner as selfish, but would see a married couple as responsible stewards." Rebecca understood that he was offering her the chance to be useful in ways that went beyond basic survival, to apply her professional skills to problems that mattered for reasons larger than immediate necessity. The prospect was appealing in ways that had nothing to do with romantic attraction and everything to do with the possibility of having her capabilities valued rather than viewed as problematic. "What about the personal aspects of the arrangement?" she asked. "Living in close quarters, navigating daily interactions, dealing with the fact that we're essentially strangers?" "We'd figure it out as we go," Daniel replied. "I'm not looking for romantic involvement, and I assume you're not either given your circumstances. But I'd expect us to treat each other with respect and consideration, to be honest about problems as they arise, and to maintain the partnership as long as it benefits both of us." The straightforward approach appealed to Rebecca's preference for clear expectations over romantic complications that would add emotional pressure to an already complex situation. She'd had enough of relationships that required her to manage other people's feelings while neglecting her own needs. "How soon would you need an answer? How soon do you need shelter from winter weather that's going to get considerably worse over the next few weeks?" The practical question reminded her that her timeline was being dictated by survival necessities rather than social conventions about courtship and engagement periods. She could spend weeks getting to know Daniel Walker under normal circumstances, but normal circumstances would probably result in her freezing to death in her car long before Christmas. "If I agreed to this," she said slowly, "when would the marriage take place?" "As soon as we can arrange it. Judge Carter and Kalispell can perform civil ceremonies with minimal paperwork, and the legal protections would take effect immediately." The speed of implementation felt both reassuring and terrifying, offering immediate solutions to her housing crisis while committing her to a legal partnership with someone whose character she was still evaluating. But Rebecca had learned that sometimes survival required making decisions with incomplete information, trusting judgment and instinct when rational analysis reached its limits. "I need some time to think about this," she said finally. "Of course, but I should mention that weather reports are calling for a significant storm system to move through the area over the next few days. If you're going to make this decision, it might be better to make it before conditions become too dangerous for travel." The practical concern was valid, but it also added pressure that made Rebecca feel like she was being rushed into a choice that would reshape her entire life. At the same time, she understood that the pressure was coming from circumstances rather than manipulation, from natural forces that didn't care about her emotional comfort or desire for extended deliberation. "Can I stay here tonight?" she asked, "to see how the arrangement might work in practice?" "You can stay as long as you need to make your decision," Daniel replied. "There's a guest room downstairs, completely private, and you're welcome to use any of the facilities." The offer felt like both generosity and practical evaluation, giving her the chance to experience his hospitality while allowing him to observe how she adapted to his living situation. Rebecca realized that they were both conducting interviews of sorts, assessing compatibility and trustworthiness under conditions that approximated their potential future partnership. As evening approached and Daniel prepared dinner with the efficient competence of someone accustomed to cooking for himself, Rebecca found herself relaxing in ways that she hadn't experienced since losing her apartment months ago. The cabin's warmth soaked into her bones, releasing tension she'd carried so long that she'd forgotten what physical comfort felt like. The meal was simple but carefully prepared, evidence of someone who valued nutrition and flavor even when cooking only for himself. They ate in companionable silence that felt natural rather than awkward, both of them apparently comfortable with quiet that didn't require constant conversation to fill empty spaces. After dinner, Rebecca helped with cleanup while Daniel banked the fire for the night, their movements around the kitchen developing the easy coordination of people who understood the value of shared domestic labor. She found herself noting his considerate habits, the way he anticipated her needs without being intrusive, his obvious respect for personal space even in the cabin's intimate quarters. When she finally settled into the guest room that would potentially become her permanent quarters, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope about what tomorrow might bring. The bed was comfortable, the room warm, and for the first time since losing her job, she wasn't calculating how many more nights she could survive in increasingly difficult circumstances. Outside her window, snow began falling again, the flakes illuminated by solar-powered lights that Daniel had positioned to mark the boundaries of his clearing. Rebecca watched the storm gather strength and realized that she'd already made her decision, that the practical necessities of survival had combined with her instinctive trust in Daniel's character to create a path forward that felt both risky and inevitable. Tomorrow, she would tell him yes, and they would begin the process of transforming two individual problems into one shared solution. The legal marriage would provide protection for both of them, while the personal partnership would offer something more valuable than security: the chance to be useful, respected, and warm through the long Montana winter that was settling over the mountains like a promise of transformation. The morning sunlight streaming through the cabin windows felt like a benediction as Rebecca opened her eyes to her first sunrise in months that didn't bring immediate anxiety about where she would sleep the following night. The guest room was warm despite the sub-zero temperatures outside, and through the frost-etched glass, she could see Daniel already moving around the clearing, tending to morning chores with the methodical efficiency of someone whose survival depended on maintaining reliable routines. She dressed quickly in clothes that felt clean for the first time in weeks, having had access to Daniel's washing machine and the luxury of hot water for a shower that had lasted nearly an hour. The simple pleasure of feeling genuinely clean had been so overwhelming that she'd nearly cried, realizing how many basic comforts she'd learned to live without during her months of homelessness. The kitchen smelled of coffee and bacon when she emerged from her room, evidence that Daniel had been awake for some time preparing what appeared to be a substantial breakfast. He looked up from the stove as she entered, his expression carrying a mixture of hope and careful neutrality that suggested he understood the importance of whatever decision she'd reached during the night. "Good morning," he said, pouring coffee into a heavy ceramic mug that radiated warmth through her palms. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in months," she replied honestly. "This place, what you've built here, it's remarkable." "It's home," he said simply. "Or it could be, for both of us, if you're willing." Rebecca settled at the kitchen table, with her coffee, watching him finish preparing breakfast with movements that spoke of long practice at solitary living. The morning light revealed details about his appearance that the previous evening's firelight had obscured: the careful way he moved that suggested old injuries, the premature gray at his temples that spoke of stress or hardship, the calluses on his hands that indicated years of physical labor. But she also noticed the gentleness with which he handled everything, from the cast-iron skillet to the delicate coffee cups, movements that suggested someone who understood that everything in his world required care to maintain. There was no waste in his actions, no careless gestures that might damage equipment he couldn't easily replace. "I've made my decision," she said as he placed a plate of eggs, bacon, and toast in front of her. Daniel settled into the chair across from her with his own breakfast, but she could see that his attention was focused entirely on her words rather than his food. The careful neutrality of his expression couldn't quite hide the tension that suggested how much her answer meant to him. "I'll marry you," she continued. "I'll be your wife, help you with whatever legal challenges you're facing, and try to make this partnership work for both of us." The relief that crossed his features was immediate and profound, transforming his stern expression into something that approached joy. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know this isn't easy, trusting someone you barely know with your entire future." "We're both taking risks," Rebecca replied. "But I've learned that sometimes the biggest risk is refusing to take any risks at all." "What convinced you?" Rebecca considered the question while eating breakfast that tasted better than anything she'd consumed in months, the flavors enhanced by the knowledge that she didn't need to make a single meal last for days. "Partly practical necessity," she admitted. Living in my car through a Montana winter would probably kill me, and this arrangement solves that problem. And partly the way you read Harper Lee, she said with a smile. And the way you've built this place, the care you put into everything, the fact that you offered me partnership instead of charity. I've had enough of being someone's burden. I'd rather be someone's ally. Daniel nodded with understanding that suggested he'd experienced his own version of unwanted charity, had learned the difference between help that empowered and help that diminished. When do you want to do this? As soon as possible. You mentioned Judge Carter in Kalispell? I can call him this morning. If the roads stay clear, we could drive down this afternoon and be married by evening. The speed felt both terrifying and liberating, offering immediate transformation from her desperate circumstances into something that resembled stability. But Rebecca had learned that sometimes hesitation was simply another word for accepting defeat, that survival often required acting on incomplete information with courage rather than certainty. What do we need to do to prepare? I'll handle the legal arrangements. You might want to gather any personal documents you have, anything that establishes your identity and background for the marriage certificate. Rebecca thought about the folder in her car containing her teaching credentials, employment history, and the accumulation of paperwork that documented her professional qualifications and personal identity. The documents represented her former life, the carefully constructed career that had been destroyed by her unwillingness to compromise her principles for institutional convenience. After we're married, she said, what happens next? We figure out how to live together, Daniel replied. We work on the legal challenges to the property, deal with whatever social obligations require a married couple instead of a hermit, and try to build something that works for both of us. And if it doesn't work, then we end the arrangement and go our separate ways, hopefully with both of us in better circumstances than we are now. The matter-of-fact approach to marriage as a practical partnership rather than romantic commitment continued to appeal to Rebecca's preference for clear expectations over emotional complications. She'd had enough of relationships that required her to manage other people's feelings while neglecting her own needs. The drive to Kalispell took 2 hours through mountain roads that challenged Daniel's four-wheel drive truck despite his obvious experience navigating difficult terrain. Rebecca found herself studying his driving technique, the way he anticipated problems and adjusted his approach accordingly, evidence of someone who understood that overconfidence in wilderness conditions could prove fatal. Judge William Carter's office occupied a corner of the Flathead County Courthouse, a functional space that suggested someone more interested in efficient legal proceedings than impressive decor. Carter himself was a man in his 60s with the kind of weathered appearance that spoke of decades spent dealing with the practical problems of rural Montana residents. Daniel Walker, he said as they entered his office, rising from behind a desk covered with legal documents and case files. Been wondering when you'd finally decide to take a wife. Judge Carter, this is Rebecca Hayes, Daniel replied. Rebecca, Judge Carter has been handling legal matters for my family for 20 years. Carter studied Rebecca with the appraising attention of someone accustomed to evaluating character quickly and accurately. Teacher, I'm told. That's good. Daniel needs someone who can help him navigate the social complexities of property ownership in these parts. The comment suggested that Daniel's legal challenges were well known to local officials, that his need for social legitimacy wasn't paranoia, but practical recognition of political realities that affected landowners who controlled significant natural resources. What can you tell me about the situation I'm marrying into? Rebecca asked directly. Carter's eyebrows rose slightly at her forthrightness, but his expression suggested approval rather than offense. Smart woman, asking the right questions. Daniel's grandfather left him some of the most valuable undeveloped land in the county, which makes certain parties interested in finding legal reasons to force a sale. What kind of legal reasons? Claims that a single man living in isolation isn't maintaining the property according to county standards, that he's hoarding water rights during drought conditions, that his presence prevents development that would benefit the broader community. And marriage would address those claims how? Married landowners are viewed differently by courts and county commissioners, Carter explained. A wife suggests permanence, community investment, the kind of conventional lifestyle that makes people comfortable with someone controlling significant resources. Rebecca was beginning to understand that Daniel's proposition involved more than personal survival. that their marriage would serve larger purposes related to land use policy and environmental preservation. The realization made her feel less like she was accepting charity and more like she was joining a cause that aligned with her own values. What are the specific challenges we'll be facing? Brookstone Development has been pushing for rezoning that would allow them to build a resort complex on the adjacent property, Carter said. They claim Daniel's water usage affects their development plans, and they've been lobbying county officials to find ways to force him to sell. Do they have a legitimate case? Not really, but they have resources to mount extended legal challenges, and they understand that most individual landowners can't afford to fight corporate lawyers indefinitely. But a married landowner with professional credentials might have better standing. Exactly. A teacher married to a landowner looks like a family committed to long-term stewardship rather than an eccentric hermit hoarding resources. The legal strategy made sense from a practical standpoint, but it also meant that Rebecca would be entering into a marriage that came with immediate adversaries who had financial incentives to challenge their legitimacy. The prospect was daunting, but also energizing, offering her the chance to apply her advocacy skills to problems that mattered for reasons larger than immediate survival. When can we perform the ceremony? Daniel asked. Right now, if you have the necessary documents, Carter replied. Montana doesn't require waiting periods for civil marriages, and I can file the paperwork immediately. The speed of implementation felt surreal as Rebecca found herself standing in a courthouse office exchanging vows with a man she'd met less than 24 hours earlier. But the ceremony itself was surprisingly meaningful, perhaps because it represented genuine partnership rather than romantic fantasy, practical commitment to mutual support rather than emotional promises that might prove impossible to keep. When Judge Carter pronounced them husband and wife, Rebecca felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with romantic love and everything to do with relief at no longer facing the world entirely alone. Daniel's handshake was firm and warm, his smile genuine without being presumptuous, his manner that of someone beginning a business partnership rather than a honeymoon. Congratulations, Carter said as he signed the marriage certificate. Daniel, you might want to file copies of this with the county clerk and the water rights office. Establish the new status officially before Brookstone's lawyers find reasons to challenge it. I'll take care of that today, Daniel replied. Rebecca, do you want to change your name legally? Rebecca Walker, she said, testing the sound of it. Yes, I think that would be appropriate for the legitimacy we're trying to establish. The name change felt like shedding a skin that no longer fit, abandoning the identity of Rebecca Hayes, who'd been fired for advocating for students, and becoming Rebecca Walker, who was married to a landowner fighting to preserve wilderness against development pressure. The transformation was more than cosmetic, representing a fundamental shift in how she understood her role in the world. The drive back to the cabin was quiet but comfortable, both of them apparently processing the magnitude of what they'd just done. Rebecca found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, seeing it not just as beautiful wilderness, but as territory she now had legal standing to help protect. Any regrets? Daniel asked as they turned onto Forest Service Road 47. None so far, she replied honestly, though I reserve the right to develop some as we figure out what married life looks like for us. Fair enough. What do you want to tackle first? I'd like to understand exactly what Brookstone Development is planning, what their legal arguments are, and what resources we have to fight them. Tonight. The cabin felt different when they returned, no longer a refuge she was visiting, but a home she was beginning to share. Daniel showed her storage areas and systems she hadn't seen during her overnight stay, explaining the solar power setup, the water filtration system, the backup generator that provided insurance against equipment failure during extended storms. But more than the technical details, she appreciated the way he shared information, treating her as a partner who needed to understand their shared resources rather than a guest who required only minimal orientation. His respect for her intelligence and capability felt like a gift after months of being treated as someone whose circumstances proved poor judgment. That evening, they spread documents across the kitchen table that told the story of Brookstone Development's efforts to force Daniel's land onto the market. Legal briefs argued that his property's water rights were being underutilized, that his presence prevented development that would create jobs and generate tax revenue, that his lifestyle suggested instability that made him unsuitable for controlling significant natural resources. They're essentially arguing that you don't deserve to own this land because you're not exploiting it aggressively enough, Rebecca observed as she read through the legal filings. That's one way to put it, Daniel agreed. They want to build a resort complex that would serve wealthy tourists while destroying the ecosystem that makes this area worth visiting in the first place. What's their timeline? They've requested county hearings for next month, hoping to get rezoning approval before winter weather makes site surveys impossible. Rebecca studied the legal calendar and felt familiar stirrings of the strategic thinking that had made her effective at navigating educational bureaucracy. We need to be visible at those hearings, present ourselves as responsible landowners with legitimate standing to oppose the rezoning. Any suggestions for how to do that? I need to research county procedures, understand who makes these decisions, and what kind of evidence they consider persuasive. Then we build a case that your stewardship serves broader community interests, better than resort development would. You sound like you've done this before. Fighting bureaucracy on behalf of people who deserve better treatment? It's what got me fired from my teaching job. Daniel's smile suggested that he understood the irony of her situation, that the same qualities that had made her unemployable in conventional educational settings might be exactly what their current circumstances required. Over the following weeks, Rebecca threw herself into the legal research with the same intensity she'd once brought to developing individualized learning plans for struggling students. She learned county zoning procedures, studied water rights law, researched environmental impact requirements that might constrain resort development. But more importantly, she began building relationships with county officials, presenting herself and Daniel as responsible citizens who understood their obligations to the broader community. Her teaching background gave her credibility with elected officials who might have dismissed Daniel's concerns as the complaints of an antisocial hermit. The transformation in how they were perceived became apparent at the first county hearing they attended together. Instead of viewing Daniel as an obstacle to progress, commissioners began seeing the Walkers as a married couple committed to responsible land stewardship that balanced individual rights with community interests. Rebecca's presentation to the County Commission was detailed and professional, arguing that pristine wilderness areas provided economic benefits through ecotourism that exceeded the short-term gains from resort development. She cited studies from other counties where large-scale development had damaged natural resources that attracted visitors, ultimately harming rather than helping local economies. Mrs. Walker makes compelling points about sustainable development. Commissioner Janet Phillips observed after Rebecca's presentation. Perhaps we should table the Brookstone rezoning request until we can commission an independent environmental impact study. The delay wasn't a complete victory, but it represented progress that wouldn't have been possible if Daniel had been fighting alone. Rebecca's credibility as an educator, combined with their status as a married couple with obvious long-term investment in the community, had shifted the political dynamics in ways that gave them leverage they hadn't possessed previously. That evening, as they celebrated their small victory with a dinner that Daniel prepared with ingredients from his greenhouse, Rebecca realized that their marriage had become something more than a practical arrangement for mutual survival. They'd developed the kind of partnership that allowed them to accomplish together what neither could have achieved alone. "Thank you," Daniel said as they cleaned up after dinner. "I've been fighting this battle for 3 years, and tonight was the first time I felt like we might actually win." "We're not finished yet," Rebecca replied. "Brookstone will appeal the delay, and they'll probably modify their development proposal to address the environmental concerns. But we've bought time to build a stronger case." "I meant thank you for more than just the legal strategy," Daniel said quietly. "Thank you for making this feel like a home instead of just a place where I hide from the world." Rebecca looked around the cabin that had become genuinely comfortable over the past month, noting the ways their shared occupancy had transformed the space. Her teaching materials now shared shelf space with his wilderness guides. Her coffee mug sat beside his on the kitchen counter, and their combined presence had created rhythms of daily life that felt natural rather than forced. "I should be thanking you," she said. "A month ago I was sleeping in my car, unemployed and desperate. Now I'm married to someone who respects my capabilities, living in a beautiful place, fighting for something that matters. It's not exactly the life I planned, but it's turning out better than anything I could have imagined." The admission was more personal than either of them usually shared, but it felt appropriate to acknowledge how their practical arrangement had evolved into something that resembled genuine partnership. They weren't in love in any conventional sense, but they developed the kind of mutual respect and affection that made their marriage feel real rather than merely legal. As winter deepened and the legal battles with Brookstone Development continued, Rebecca found herself settling into routines that felt increasingly natural. She managed their correspondence with lawyers and county officials, organized their documentation for upcoming hearings, and developed strategic plans for protecting the property that had become their shared responsibility. But she also discovered that Daniel was an engaging companion who shared her love of reading, her interest in complex problem-solving, and her belief that individual actions could make meaningful differences in larger issues. Their evening conversations ranged from practical planning to philosophical discussions that reminded her how much she'd missed intellectual companionship during her months of isolation. The cabin itself proved remarkably comfortable for two people who respected each other's need for personal space. Daniel had converted a storage room into a private office for Rebecca, where she could work on legal research and maintain correspondence with former colleagues who might provide character references for upcoming hearings. More surprisingly, she'd begun exploring the possibility of returning to education through alternative channels that wouldn't require approval from traditional school districts. Several families in the Pine Ridge area had expressed interest in homeschooling support, and her marriage to Daniel had given her the kind of local credibility that might allow her to develop a private tutoring practice. The work would be different from classroom teaching, more individualized and flexible, but it would allow her to apply her educational expertise in ways that served students without requiring her to navigate bureaucratic systems that had proven hostile to her advocacy approaches. By late February, when Brookstone Development requested another hearing to present their modified development proposal, Rebecca and Daniel had transformed from desperate individuals seeking mutual survival into a formidable partnership capable of mounting sophisticated opposition to corporate pressure. Their marriage had provided them with legal standing, social legitimacy, and the combined strengths that made them more effective together than either could have been alone. But more than that, it had given them both the kind of home that neither had been able to create independently. The morning of the final county hearing, Rebecca woke to find Daniel already up, preparing coffee and breakfast with the careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to their shared welfare. The February sunrise painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold, illuminating the wilderness that their partnership was working to preserve. "Ready for this?" he asked as she joined him in the kitchen. "More ready than I've ever been for anything," she replied, meaning it completely. The hearing lasted 6 hours, with Brookstone's lawyers presenting detailed plans for a resort complex that would provide jobs and tax revenue, while supposedly minimizing environmental impact. But Rebecca's counterpresentation was equally detailed, demonstrating that the development would damage water resources, destroy wildlife habitat, and ultimately harm the natural beauty that attracted tourism to the area. More importantly, she and Daniel presented themselves as responsible stewards who understood their obligations to both their property and their community, married landowners whose long-term commitment to the area gave them standing to speak about what development policies would best serve regional interests. When the county commission voted unanimously to deny Brookstone's rezoning request, citing environmental concerns and community opposition, Rebecca felt the kind of satisfaction she'd once experienced when helping struggling students achieve breakthrough moments in their learning. The commission finds that the current zoning appropriately protects natural resources that serve broader community interests, Commissioner Phillips announced. The Walker property will remain zoned for conservation use, and we encourage other landowners to consider similar stewardship approaches. The victory was complete and decisive, representing not just successful defense of Daniel's property rights, but validation of their approach to marriage as a partnership for mutual empowerment rather than romantic dependency. That evening, they celebrated with a dinner that featured the first vegetables from Daniel's expanded greenhouse operation. Rebecca reflected on how thoroughly her life had been transformed by a single decision to trust in possibilities rather than accepting defeat. 6 months earlier, she'd been sleeping in her car, unemployed and desperate, facing the prospect of freezing to death during a Montana winter. Now she was married to someone who respected her capabilities, living in a home they'd successfully defended against corporate pressure, and building a life that combined individual fulfillment with shared purpose. The marriage that had begun as a practical arrangement for mutual survival had evolved into something that felt increasingly like love, not the romantic passion of fairy tales, but the deeper affection that grew from shared challenges, mutual respect, and the recognition that they'd created together something more valuable than either could have achieved alone. Any regrets? Daniel asked as they cleaned up after their celebration dinner. Only that it took me so long to realize that sometimes the most practical choice is also the most transformative one, Rebecca replied. What do you mean? I spent my whole career believing that doing the right thing would eventually be rewarded, that systems would protect people who served them faithfully. When that proved false, I thought I'd failed. And now I understand that sometimes the system is the problem, and the solution is finding people who share your values and building something new together. Daniel's smile suggested that he understood exactly what she meant, that their marriage represented more than successful legal strategy or convenient living arrangements. They'd created a partnership that allowed them to be more than they could have been separately, to fight for principles that mattered while building a life that felt genuinely satisfying. As spring arrived and the snow began melting from the mountain peaks, Rebecca started her private tutoring practice with 3 families who wanted individualized educational support for their children. The work was exactly what she'd hoped teaching could be, focused on student needs rather than administrative requirements, designed to help children learn rather than simply pass standardized tests. Her office in the cabin became a classroom where she could apply her educational expertise without bureaucratic interference, where parents valued her advocacy for their children rather than viewing it as insubordination. The income wasn't large, but it was sufficient to contribute meaningfully to their household expenses while providing her with the professional satisfaction she'd thought was lost forever. Daniel's legal victories had attracted attention from other landowners facing development pressure, and he'd begun consulting on conservation strategies that allowed him to use his expertise while generating additional income. Their combined efforts were building something that felt like a sustainable lifestyle rather than merely successful survival. More importantly, their marriage had evolved into the kind of partnership that neither had expected but both had come to value deeply. They'd learned to appreciate each other's strengths, to support each other through challenges, and to create a home that felt like sanctuary rather than simply shelter. On their first anniversary, as they sat on the cabin's porch watching sunset paint the mountain peaks in brilliant colors, Rebecca reflected on how completely her understanding of marriage, home, and purpose had been transformed by their unconventional beginning. "Thank you," she said to Daniel, "for seeing possibilities instead of just problems, for offering partnership instead of charity, for helping me remember that sometimes the most dangerous choice is also the only one that leads to genuine freedom." "Thank you," he replied, "for having the courage to say yes when saying no would have been easier, for bringing skills I needed and wisdom I didn't know I was missing, for making this place feel like home instead of just a refuge." The anniversary celebration was quiet but deeply satisfying, marking not just the survival of their practical arrangement, but the flourishing of a relationship that had grown from mutual necessity into mutual choice. They'd built something together that served their individual needs while creating value larger than either could have achieved alone. As Rebecca looked across the wilderness they'd successfully defended toward the town where she was building a new teaching practice, she realized that the homeless teacher and the mountain man had become something entirely new. Partners in every sense of the word, committed to each other and to the land they shared, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The mountain man's declaration that he needed a wife had seemed like the beginning of a desperate bargain between strangers. But it had become the foundation of a marriage that proved that sometimes the most practical arrangements could also be the most transformative, that sometimes survival required taking risks that looked like madness from the outside but felt like salvation from within. Their story would continue, bringing new challenges and new opportunities to grow together, but the foundation they'd built was solid enough to support whatever came next. They'd learned that home wasn't just a place, but a partnership, that family that could be chosen as well as inherited, and that sometimes the most important decisions were the ones that looked impossible until they became inevitable. Up next, You've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.